My brother Johnny and I were staying at a cabin in northern Montana, nestled in a valley between the mountains and shrouded by a dense canopy of trees. Both of us were avid outdoorsmen, so this was a typical excursion for us, spending time in the woods, hiking and exploring the wilderness. Given the long drive, we spent our first day taking it easy, lingering around the cabin and soaking in the scenery. Around 5:30 p.m. as the sun began its descent, Johnny decided to go for a short walk before nightfall. I paid him little mind, simply acknowledging him with an all right as he walked out the door. He didn't take a backpack or any gear, so I knew he wouldn't be long. I lay back on the couch near the fireplace, exhausted from having done most of the driving. I must have dozed off because when I opened my eyes, the cabin was growing darker and darker as the sun slipped behind the mountains. It was only when the fireplace was the sole source of light that I realized Johnny had returned. It was far too dark to be walking around without any equipment. I shot up from the couch, grabbed my day pack, a headlamp, and a flashlight, and headed out to make sure he was okay. My first thought and knot of anxiety in my stomach was that we were in bear country. However, as I ventured deeper into the woods along the trail, my nervousness shifted to a different, more unnerving possibility. I was overcome with a dreadful feeling, a primal instinct that made me glance over my shoulder several times as if expecting to see someone there. I never did. Barely 10 minutes down the path, I saw a figure approaching. It was Johnny. He looked uneasy, and while he wasn't sprinting, he was moving with purposeful haste, as if trying to escape something. We started talking over each other. I was trying to ask what was wrong while he was urging me to turn back toward the cabin. We both fell into a fast walk, not stopping until we were safely back inside. There he told me he'd seen someone watching him from the trees. He described the man as deeply unsettling. As Johnny continued along the trail, the man seemed to be stalking him, mirroring his movements from a distance. Johnny feared that if he walked back to the cabin in the daylight, the man might follow him, so he waited until dark. Trying to be the responsible older brother, Johnny assured me it was probably nothing and that he was just being cautious. I trusted him and tried to push the worry from my mind. The man he saw probably had a nearby cabin or was just another hiker. We made dinner and sat on the front porch for the rest of the evening beside a campfire. I think we were both covertly scanning the darkness, watching for any sign of being observed, though neither of us would admit it. As the night deepened, the mountains grew silent. We talked by the fire late into the night before finally turning in. After a quick breakfast, we packed our bags for the main event, a 6-hour hike to the peak of a nearby mountain. We were utterly exhausted afterward. The final hour of the trek back to the cabin felt endless. Once inside, Johnny dropped his bag and announced he was going to take a shower. I collapsed onto the couch to wait my turn. As I lay there, my thoughts drifted back to the man my brother had seen the day before. I got up and peered out the windows, half expecting to see him standing there. Seeing nothing, I returned to the couch, but a strange feeling had settled over me. A few minutes passed as I tried to identify the source of my unease, and then I realized the obnoxious groan of the cabin's water pump for the shower had never started.
"Johnny," I called out. No response.
I stood up and walked down the hall toward the bedroom. I knocked on the door and called his name again. An unsettling feeling washed over me as I reached for the handle and cracked the door open. Peeking through the narrow gap, I saw him. Johnny was kneeling in the far corner of the room, his eyes wide with terror fixed on me. He was subtly, almost imperceptibly shaking his head, a clear warning to stay away. The sheer fear in his eyes as a horrifying image burned into my memory. I pushed the door fully open and saw him, a man standing just a few feet from my brother. He also had wide eyes, but his were tired and disturbing. He wore disheveled, torn clothes and had long, oily black hair. In that split second, there was no time for thought, only a raw, protective instinct. I charged him. Only when I was a couple of steps away did I see him raise a gun from his side. I tackled him, and Johnny immediately sprang into action. Together we wrestled the gun from his grasp and fought to subdue him. The man was feral, screeching and clawing like a trapped animal. I had never witnessed anything so primal. He wouldn't give up, so it took us a moment to figure out a plan. We decided that Johnny, who was much bigger than me, would hold him down while I got the car ready. I ran out, tossed our already packed bags into the car and started the engine. I raced back inside and we used whatever we could find, belts, rope, fabric, to tie the man up just enough to give us time to escape. We took the gun with us. As we sped away, we could hear his inhuman screams echoing from inside the cabin. Once we had cell service, we called the police. By the time they reached the remote cabin, however, the man was gone. All that remained were the scraps we had used to bind him lying discarded on the floor. My brother later told me that when he walked into the bedroom, the man had caught him completely off guard, holding him at gunpoint and ordering him to call me into the room. Johnny refused, knowing it would be a trap, but then I walked in on my own. We still talk about the insanity of that moment of me tackling an armed man. I can't explain it, but that impulsive act might be what got us out of that cabin alive. The only clue the authorities have is the gun we gave them. They traced his registration to a man who had been reported missing 5 years earlier from a town about 50 miles away. Based on our description, the attacker was not the gun's owner. The grim conclusion is that whoever attacked us had likely done the same to the owner of the firearm, leaving him a missing person, a fate that could have easily been ours. Story 2: The cabin my father built. In 2016, I made a trip to my father's old cabin. It was a 6-hour drive away deep in the woods outside the town where he grew up, a place that was no longer a town, just a derelict row of buildings along a deserted road. We rarely visited when he was alive. He said there was no reason to go back once the town died. But after he passed away, I thought it would be a fitting tribute to visit the home he had once built. I knew it would be in rough shape and wanted to do what I could to restore it to preserve it for as long as possible. More than anything, I hoped the trip would offer some peace and quiet. I parked my car behind an abandoned gas station and began the 2-mile. Hike up a thin, rugged trail to the cabin, carrying my backpacking gear and the necessary tools. A part of me was prepared to find that the structure had already collapsed, ready to pitch a tent for the night. Fortunately, after the long trek, I found the cabin still standing in a small clearing.
It was a basic log rectangle with vines and moss creeping up its outer walls.
The door was unlocked. The interior was in appalling condition. Trash was scattered everywhere, and a musty, unpleasant smell filled the single room. It was clear someone had squatted here at some point, perhaps for a while, though it didn't seem recent. There were no signs of life from the past couple of years. I cleared a space in a corner for my gear. With the sun already setting, I unrolled my sleeping bag and settled in for the night. I should mention that while I didn't see or hear anything specific, I couldn't sleep for more than 30 minutes at a time. I kept waking up with a strange, disturbing feeling, making for a miserable night. I rose with the sun groggy and already questioning the wisdom of this trip. After brewing coffee on my camp stove, I took a walk to clear my head. In the dim pre-dawn light, I found a small hill that served as an overlook, offering a view above the tree line. It seemed like the perfect spot to watch the sunrise. But from there I saw something else. In the far distance I could see the abandoned town, and in one of the buildings a light was on in a window. From that distance I couldn't tell if it was a house or a store. A minute later it winked out. The sight made me worry about my car, but mostly I was just surprised that anyone else was around. It was likely just urban explorers, I told myself, a strange coincidence. I sat on the hill for an hour, then headed back to start my work. I spent the day resealing and cleaning the cabin's exterior. The entire time, however, I couldn't shake the unnerving feeling from the night before. This eerie sense loomed over me, making me constantly look back toward the woods. It took me a while to identify the feeling, but eventually I understood. I felt like I wasn't alone. As the sun began to set, I went inside and fired up the old wood stove. The thing was indestructible. It lit up without issue and began to warm the cabin. I sat near its comforting crackle, my thoughts drifting to my dad, this trip, and life in general. But later that night, the crackling of the flames was joined by another sound, the crunch of leaves and snapping of twigs coming from outside. I turned my head and listened intently. It was not an animal. The footsteps were distinctly human. Just as they reached the front door, the roar of the wood stove seemed to intensify, drowning out any subtle sounds from outside. Then came a knock.
A man's voice called out a name that made my world stop my father's.
A wave of shock sent me to my feet, and I found myself walking to the other side of the door. How did he know my dad? I couldn't stop myself from calling out, Who are you?" The man outside hesitated, likely realizing from my voice that I wasn't who he was expecting. "I'm an old friend of the man who built this cabin," he said. "Was hoping I'd get to see him again." I moved closer to the door, overcome by the urge to open it to talk to someone who knew my father to hear stories. Yet something held me back. "Why are you here?" I asked. The man replied that he lived in the old town. After a moment's thought, I decided to tell him. "I'm his son. My dad, he passed away." The man behind the door paused. "I'm real sorry to hear that, kid. Wish I could have seen him one more time." Initially, the words were a comfort, but I quickly sensed something was wrong. There was an insincerity in his voice. It lacked the sadness I would expect from someone who had just lost a friend. Before I could process it, almost as if he knew I was thinking too hard, the man continued. "Why don't you open up so we can have a chat? It's real cold out here, son. Would be nice to share that fire." Though he spoke slowly, I detected an urgency, a lack of patience just beneath the surface. A cold certainty grew within me. He was not being truthful. He may have known my dad's name, but how could I be sure he was a friend? As I stood there in silent deliberation, the man asked again for me to open up. He knocked once more, this time more harshly. His voice grew less kind, more demanding. I took several steps back from the door. "Kid, open the door," he growled. "You going to let me die out here in the cold? Is that what your father would want?" My heart pounded as I rummaged in my backpack for my hunting knife. The man continued to hammer on the door, his voice now laced with subtle threats, the pretense of a harmless friend completely abandoned. This went on for what felt like an eternity, a relentless nightmare. Suddenly he punched the door in a final act of fury. The sound was followed by his footsteps retreating back into the woods. I stayed awake all night, my mind racing, paralyzed by fear. When the sun finally rose and there was no sign of him, I hastily packed my bag and ran from the cabin. I was lucky my car was untouched, still hidden behind the crumbling gas station. I fled that town and didn't stop driving until I was home. I had hoped the trip would provide answers, but I left with only more questions. I realized I never truly knew why my father moved away. I had always assumed it was because the town was dying, but now I suspect there was more to it. Perhaps there was a reason he never brought me back to his cabin. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted from me, but something tells me he had no good intentions. Had I let my emotions get the better of me and opened that door, I genuinely don't think I ever would have made it out of that town. Story 3. The Watcher on the Property. This happened back in 2014 when I was taking a gap year to travel the country out of my car. While on the East Coast, my cousin offered me his cabin located just south of the Appalachian Mountains. I gladly accepted, knowing it would be a welcome break to have a real place to stay for a few days. The cabin was beautiful, more of a modern vacation home than the rustic log cabins you typically find in the forest. Honestly, I was surprised he was letting me stay there for free. As I was moving my things from the car, I noticed someone watching me. A man was standing at the edge of the tree line, far from the path. With nothing else in his view but me in the house, he had to be looking at me. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he wasn't trying to be creepy. I didn't know the area. For all I knew, other houses could be hidden just beyond the trees. I grabbed the rest of my belongings, locked my car, and went inside. As I closed the door, I saw the man was still there facing the cabin. I sent a text to my cousin to let him know I'd arrived safely, but I also mentioned the man watching me and asked if he knew who it might be. I got busy unpacking and didn't check his reply until nearly an hour later, well after sunset. His message sent a jolt of fear through me. He said the cabin was on 40 acres of his private property surrounded by a fence. Nobody else should have been out there. Suddenly, the encounter felt far more sinister. I went to look outside again, but beyond the pool of light cast by the cabin, the world was pitch black. The tree line had vanished into an impenetrable wall of darkness. A chill traced its way down my spine as I drew the curtains shut. I tried to distract myself by watching a movie in the bedroom. It helped occupy my mind, but it didn't completely dispel my unease. About an hour and a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye caught my attention. I locked my gaze on the window where there was a small gap in the curtains. I thought I had seen something pass by, but now all I could see was my blurry reflection against the blackness outside. I quickly got up and started toward the window, but was stopped by the sudden sound of footsteps sprinting through the grass outside. By the time I peered out, there was nothing to see, only the faint sound of the footsteps receding into the dark. I immediately called my cousin. In hindsight, I should have called the police directly, but my cousin told me to do just that. I hung up and had the police on their way within a minute. For how remote the cabin was, an officer arrived in a decent amount of time. The man, however, was long gone. We both quickly realized there was little the officer could do unless the intruder reappeared. So I was left alone once again, unable to shake the gnawing feeling of dread. I considered leaving, but the thought of carrying all my things back out to the car in the oppressive darkness was somehow more terrifying than staying put. For the next hour, I paced the house, double-checking locks and peering out the windows into the void, trying to convince myself it was safe enough to sleep. It must have been 12 or 1 a.m. when I finally gave in to exhaustion. I turned off all the lights, went into the bedroom, and locked the door. I woke up very early to that disorienting pre-dawn gloom. It had to be around 4 a.m. Almost immediately, my mind snapped back into a state of panic. I knew I wouldn't be able to rest again until I had checked the house. I got up, turned on the hallway light, and just listened. The only sound was the heavy wind buffeting the thin windows.